Hello, US 102 history class. Um, we are ending on an important section, and we have one more week before finals. So we are just about done. Uh, I hope that you appreciate the fact that I've pulled back on some required essays in the last few weeks, hoping that you all could do more of a job focusing on the material. I think I'm covering quite a bit of important information that kind of makes sense of what's going on. By the way, I'm in Portland, Oregon right now, doing some other work over here too. It's a lot more wet and green than the Central Valley. um, anyhow, so look, um, there's a lot to unpack when it comes to being a history professor and to teach a history class, especially when it's a survey course. Um, what do I bring up? What do I leave out? And sometimes even just the topics that we pick reveal a certain bias on our part in the sense that that's what we're picking. But having said that, we do have limited time. And so, yes, I'm focusing more on stuff dealing with foreign policy and war because I do think that it really shapes defining who the United States is on a global scale. And many of the topics that we have domestically, especially since the shift from the Cold War, when we were the country, the United States government was like in a war against communism, which was really concrete, right? To say that you're against a communist ideology and states that claim communism, that is a concrete argument, whether you agree or disagree with that, right? Okay, because you have an ideology that has a different philosophy about economics. It has a different idea of what a democracy looks like. The communist states call themselves people's republics, or they did call themselves democratic, but they looked at it in a very different way that the majority of the Western liberal capitalist world saw as dictatorial or even totalitarian. So there was an ideological worldview difference. Part of my theory, by the way, as to why the United States was against communism when they were supporting so many other dictators, is that at least initially, communism would have the state take control of all of the resources, or the majority of the resources, and the labor pool of that given country was in the hands or in the control of the party in the state apparatus. Now, from the Western liberal capitalist point of view, especially third world countries or nations that have developing economies, like France was extracting from Vietnam, taking their goods, and then the Vietnamese are going to kick out the French, and then the Vietnamese are going to take control of their own resources, and that will close out, at least at that temporary time, markets that the French and other Western nations were privileged to. And so my argument has always been, and I wrote a book on this I never published, is that that's the sin of communism, really. For as far as the United States and the West has been concerned, in that communism has only been bad because of its effects on access to markets. And then when China opens up its markets, it doesn't change the political system. The West brought in a bunch of business and facilitated the rise of China. And now we have all the controversy of the rise of China with our current president. And so I wasn't able to kind of cover all of that before. That's also kind of dealing with the topic of Western civilization and international politics. But the bottom line is, what I'm trying to point out is that at that Cold War, those times, there was this concrete battle, right? And then it falls apart. I kind of talked about this in the last week. And it transitions to a war on terror. We have 9/11. This is the history we covered. But one one military advisor, a politician that worked under Carter, he pointed out that there was a problem with this term war on terror. He said that is a war. Terror is a tactic. how do you have a war on a tactic? Do you see how that's a much more complicated kind of argument? What does it mean to be, when you call that a war on terror? And if we're going to be honest, it is true. There's a saying in politics that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. According to the British, when U.S. patriots were shooting our police officers, which were the British soldiers, by the way, they weren't separate. We were British subjects. So they viewed it as cop killing. We saw them as oppressive entities acting as foreign agents. They felt foreign, and it felt like they were taking our rights away. And we won, and then we got to call ourselves patriots and freedom fighters. But had we lost, we would have been called terrorists, at least those who took up arms against the British state, people who damaged the property, like in the Tea Party, dipping the tea into the would have been seen as vandalist terrorists. This is the reality of these terms. So the war on terror becomes complicated because then the United States has certain allies that are also dictators that are having people resist against them, and they're saying, hey, give us money and military aid to help us fight our terrorists. But you see, becomes much more murky, like what exactly is the United States becoming and supporting at this point. Now, I'm ending this section on the positivity of Obama getting elected and the euphoria and the inspiration of having the first black president in a country that, had slavery, and blacks were not even considered humans for the most part. We had chattel slavery, and here we have the first president. Very important, very impactful presidential election, and rightly so. But Obama, if we're to fairly look at his history and we compare the history of Bush and we go back and we're going to analyze the U.S. as a large military superpower, some even call an empire, he is going to continue to perpetuate this foreign policy, this war on terror that is also still going to remain vague and, for many people, problematic. I'm going to talk about more of this next week, or last week, such as his escalation of drone wars. But we have the issue of U.S. liberty and freedom being reduced from George Bush's Patriot Act to the National Security Act, I believe, NSA. Obama also reducing our liberties based on the idea of protecting us from terrorists. Some people say these are necessary for the state to do. Others call these excuses to get rid of our liberties. And then if another president wants to come into office and get more power, having those kind of institutions around could be more useful to them to take in more power. So that was the controversy being even brought up back then. And I just want to point that out. Also, just the fact that, if you look, I can't understate that from Bill Clinton to Obama to Trump. I mean, Biden too, but I would say Bill Clinton, Obama, and Trump have had the most media sensation of loving them or really, really going at them. And so, like, with the Republican Party, just so for example, my dear grandfather, may he rest in peace, when I would go to his house, had an AM radio blasting, and it was about every evil that came into the planet came from the Clintons. And it was always the Clintons. So even then, it was the President Bill Clinton and his wife, Hillary, were just viewed as this major problem in America. And I remember the rage coming out about the Clintons, right? And then there was, and by the way, he was impeached as well, just like Trump, but also, was able to come out of that. Then Obama, super celebrated and loved on one hand, but Fox News even did an episode. It was was a brown jacket gate where he wore a light brown outfit, and they were even attacking that and how unpresidential that was. Or he was holding a cup of coffee and didn't salute the Marines properly or something coming down, and there was that happening. And then you see that same kind of thing happening to Trump as well, where he has a bad hair day, and maybe he always has a bad hair day, but I don't know, maybe I have a bad hair day. The bottom line is very polarizing media representations of these kind of presidents. Again, Biden too quite a bit, but when I really think about comparing those other three, much more pronounced. Some people will say that some of those criticisms have been deserved or not. I'm not dealing with that right now. I'm just letting you know those are historic realities that has happened right now. We are going to end at a time where I'm limited. Right? I'm not going to be able to get us right up to this really intense time period where we have a president right now that, whether you love him or hate him, is going to go down in history as the most controversial history ever, period. Okay, so you're living this history. I'm telling you right now, let me just make this very clear. I think the first Trump presidency, which we will get to next week, you could say he was also different, but he was more like an Andrew Jackson's type of character who he found inspiration in. And I'll get more into that. But I don't know. I mean, he was still very different. But then, the things that's happened with him post his first presidency and coming back and what's going on with the tariff wars, calling Canada the 51st state, talking about annexing Canada, about getting Greenland, about taking the Panama Canal back, about ignoring Supreme Court ruling or justice rulings if they go against what he thinks should be. These are all way off the chart of history. Now, what I'm just trying to say, I might add a little bit more about this next. We're not going to really be covering that. We're going to have enough time to kind of get us to understanding how America got to this place. Now, listen, you may love our president, you may hate him. I'm not trying to actually push anything about that, but I don't think it's controversial to say all the things that I just said. That's empirical. That these are, and he wants to be the most memorable president, and so he's definitely doing a good job of that. And that can go to be remembered for something can be very positive or negative, and obviously there's a history where we're going to see how that all unfolds. Now, so just keep in mind, again, I'm going to be limited on what I can bring up. There's going to be, next week is the only time I have left to get us to everything that's happened to get us to where we're at now. So that's going to be limited. But I really feel like you as a class, if you really kind of think about some of the things we've talked about and what you've read, and you need to make sure, right, you're reading the history, looking at different things. And if you talk about these with your friends and your family, which helps you remember a lot of what you learned, you are going to see that you really are up to date on a lot of stuff that so many, even intelligent Americans, are just not, Americans just don't study history that much. They just don't. And they're not aware of so many things. So I'm hoping that you'll really value all the stuff that you've been learning, and I'll leave it at that. Again, we have one more week left for me to cover material, and then final, okay? And so right now, also, there's going to be a time where I don't take any more late work in. So if you have a lot of assignments missing, you need to contact me now, because there's going to be a cutoff at a certain point for any late work, even if you ask me, just because I'm going to be out of time. That's it. So that's all I have to say. I hope you all are doing well, and we'll be in touch.